Chapter 1. An Invitation to Hawthorn Manor. The Yorkshire countryside rolled gently under a grey, overcast sky, its vast stretches of farmland dotted with the occasional thatched cottage or towering oak tree. Hawthorn Manor stood on a hill overlooking the quiet landscape. From the narrow road that wound its way toward the house, one could see the grandeur of its size, the imposing gates standing like silent sentinels. The carriage rattled over the gravel path leading up to the manor. Inside, Inspector Archibald Price of Scotland Yard sat deep in thought, his sharp grey eyes scanning the view ahead. He'd been here once before, years ago, under far less troubling circumstances. Yet, today, as the familiar silhouette of the manor came into view, there was an unmistakable weight hanging in the air. He had been off duty for about a week, enjoying a much-needed break when a letter had arrived for him at his house. Now, reaching into his coat pocket, he retrieved the letter and read it again. "Inspector Price, your presence is urgently requested at Hawthorn Manor. It is a matter of great importance and family strife. I fear that tensions may escalate, and without intervention, irreparable harm may be done. I trust that you will treat this matter with the utmost discretion." It was signed by Edward Hawthorne, the head of the estate, and one of England's most prominent industrialists. Hawthorne had made his fortune in coal and iron, amassing great wealth over the years. But wealth had brought its own set of problems, as it so often did. Rumours had been circulating for months about discord within the family, particularly between Edward and his estranged niece, Clara. Price had heard whispers from contacts in London about bitter disputes over inheritance and unresolved grievances. Still, he hadn't expected to be drawn into the matter personally. As the carriage came to a halt at the entrance of the grand house, the heavy wooden doors of the manor creaked open, and a butler emerged, bowing stiffly as Price stepped out. The inspector took a moment to adjust his hat and coat, his gaze travelling up the grand facade of the manor. It was larger than he remembered, and far less inviting. "Inspector Price, I presume?" the butler inquired with a well-practiced air of detachment. "Indeed," Price replied, nodding curtly. "I assume Mr. Hawthorne is expecting me." "Yes, sir. If you would follow me, Mr. Hawthorne is in the drawing-room. The other guests have already arrived." Price followed the butler through the grand entrance hall, its marble floors gleaming in the dim light. Portraits of the Hawthorne family lined the walls, their cold, expressionless faces staring down at him. It was a house that bore its history heavily, the weight of generations etched into every stone. As they approached the drawing-room, the soft murmur of voices grew louder. The door was opened for him, and Price stepped inside to find a gathering of people seated around a roaring fire, the crackling flames providing the only warmth in the otherwise cool room. His entrance drew their attention, and for a moment, the conversation ceased. At the head of the group, standing near the fireplace, was Edward Hawthorne himself. A tall man in his early 60s, Hawthorne had the imposing presence of someone used to commanding respect, though his once strong features were now softened by age. His grey hair was neatly combed, and his piercing blue eyes gave nothing away as he greeted Price. "Inspector Price, I'm grateful you could come," Hawthorne said, his voice steady but strained. "Please, join us. There are a few people I'd like you to meet." Price nodded and took a seat, his eyes discreetly sweeping over the assembled guests. Hawthorne gestured to each in turn. "This is Lady Evelyn Kensington," he began, motioning to a middle-aged woman seated closest to the fire. Dressed in expensive, well-tailored garments, Lady Evelyn looked every bit the aristocrat, her sharp, hawk-like features giving off an air of superiority. She gave Price a curt nod, but the disinterest in her eyes was palpable. "Dr. Frederick Wilton," Hawthorne continued, turning to a man in his 50s seated beside Lady Evelyn. The doctor had the look of a man who had seen more than his share of hardships. His kind, if weary expression betrayed his years of service to the family. He extended a hand to Price, which the inspector shook firmly. "Charles Benton," Hawthorne added, introducing the last man in the room. Benton, in his mid-30s, was sharply dressed, with a smile that seemed too quick and too rehearsed. Price had encountered his type before, charming on the surface, but always with something to hide. And finally, Hawthorne said, his tone darkening slightly, my niece, Clara Hawthorne. Seated in the corner of the room, Clara looked up from where she had been staring into the fire. She was a young woman, no older than 30, with dark hair and sharp, striking features that mirrored her uncle's. Her expression was one of defiance, and there was a coldness in her eyes that made Price immediately aware of the tension that filled the room. "Inspector Price," she said with a slight nod, though there was no warmth in her greeting. "It seems I've arrived just in time," Price remarked dryly, sensing the undercurrent of hostility between uncle and niece. "Indeed," Hawthorne replied, his voice stiffening. "I hope your presence will help restore some order to the situation. There have been certain disputes within the family, as you may have heard." Clara's gaze hardened, but she said nothing. "Well," Price said, leaning forward slightly, "perhaps it's best we discuss matters openly. If I'm to be of any help, I'll need to understand exactly what's going on here." Hawthorne hesitated, his eyes flickering to Clara before he spoke. "I'll explain everything in due time. For now, though, I suggest we all retire to our rooms. It's been a long day for everyone, and I fear we may need our strength for what lies ahead." The tension in the room was palpable as the guests began to rise and make their way to their chambers. Price watched as Clara stood without a word and left the room, her back straight, her movements deliberate. As the door closed behind her, Edward Hawthorne sighed heavily and turned to Price. "I fear things are about to get much worse, Inspector." Price nodded. He had a feeling that Hawthorne's premonition was more than just familial anxiety. There was something darker at play here. Chapter 2. Tensions at the Dinner Table. The next day, the guests played cards or strolled around the grand estate. Everyone was to get together for dinner, for the dining room and the dinner at Hawthorn Manor was a grand affair, with a long oak table at its centre, surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in rich burgundy velvet. A chandelier hung overhead, its flickering candles casting a warm glow over the guests who sat in tense silence, awaiting the evening meal. Inspector Price sat at one end of the table, keenly aware of the charged atmosphere surrounding him. Edward Hawthorne sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his face stern. To his left was Lady Evelyn Kensington, who appeared wholly uninterested in anything that was happening around her, her attention focused more on her wineglass than on the people at the table. Across from her sat Dr. Frederick Wilton, who kept his eyes on his plate, avoiding conversation, and occasionally glancing at Hawthorne as if waiting for a cue to speak. But it was Clara Hawthorne, seated directly opposite her uncle, who drew Price's attention the most. She was staring at Edward with a quiet intensity, her jaw clenched, her hands resting tensely on the table. Price sensed that it wouldn't take much to ignite the fire that smoldered beneath her calm exterior. Finally, the silence was broken when Edward cleared his throat and addressed his niece. "Clara, I assume you've come here with some purpose beyond stirring up old grievances." Clara's eyes narrowed, and she straightened in her chair. "I came here to claim what's rightfully mine, Uncle. You can no longer keep me out of the family affairs, as you have for all these years." Edward's expression hardened. "You were the one who left, Clara. You chose to distance yourself from this family, from everything your parents built. And now, after all this time, you expect to walk back in here and make demands?" Clara scoffed, her hands tightening into fists. "You know very well why I left. You drove me away, just as you drove my parents to their graves. If it weren't for your greed, they would still be alive." The sharp accusation hung in the air like a blade, cutting through the fragile veneer of civility that had been maintained until now. The other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that they were witnessing a deeply personal confrontation. Lady Evelyn set down her wineglass with a soft clink, her voice laced with irritation. "Really, Clara? Must we do this now? Can't we at least attempt to have a pleasant dinner before dragging the family's dirty laundry out for all to see?" Clara shot her a venomous look. "Stay out of this, Evelyn. You've no stake in this family beyond the money you've leached from it." Lady Evelyn bristled but said nothing further, though her expression clearly showed her disdain. Price quietly observed the exchange, his keen mind filing away every detail. There was more to this dispute than the inheritance. The bitterness in Clara's voice was too personal, too deep-seated to be purely about money. Edward, his face reddening with anger, slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the silverware. "That's enough, Clara. You've been nothing but a disappointment to this family, and I will not sit here and listen to your baseless accusations." "Baseless?" Clara's voice rose, her anger bubbling to the surface. "My parents died in poverty because of you. You refused to help them when they needed it most. And now you sit here in your grand manor, surrounded by wealth, while their names are forgotten. You disgust me." The room fell deathly silent. Even Dr. Wilton, who had been studiously avoiding the argument, looked up in alarm, his brow furrowed with concern. Price watched closely, noting the tremor in Edward's hands, the way his eyes darted briefly to the portraits on the walls before returning to Clara. "I loved your parents," Edward said, his voice lower now but still laced with anger. "They made their own choices, and so did you, Clara. You're not welcome in this house, as long as you persist in these wild accusations." Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her face was pale with fury. "Then I'll take what's mine through the courts. Believe me, Uncle, I have the evidence to prove what you've done." With that, she turned and stormed out of the dining room, her footsteps echoing through the manor's long, empty corridors. The tension she left behind was suffocating. Edward remained seated, his face a mask of fury, his breathing heavy as he struggled to regain control of his emotions. Price glanced around the table. Lady Evelyn looked thoroughly bored, as though this drama had become tiresome to her. Dr. Wilton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Edward and the door through which Clara had just exited. "Well," Lady Evelyn said dryly, picking up her glass once more, "that went about as well as one could expect." Edward shot her a look of disdain but said nothing. Instead, he turned his attention to Price, his expression hard. "Inspector, I asked you here because I knew something like this was coming. Clara has become volatile. She's always had a difficult temperament, but now she's turned completely against me. She's been making threats, legal threats, and I have no doubt she'll act on them. I need your help to ensure that she doesn't do something reckless." Price nodded, his face impassive. This wasn't just a family quarrel. There were deeper wounds here, wounds that Clara intended to reopen, wounds that could drive someone to desperate measures. "I'll do what I can, Mr. Hawthorne," Price said carefully, "but I'll need to know more about the situation between you and your niece." Edward sighed, his anger giving way to weariness. "She blames me for everything, her parents' deaths, their financial troubles, everything. She's convinced that I abandoned them when they needed me most, but that's not true. I did what I could, but they refused my help, and now she's determined to destroy me." Price studied Edward's face, looking for any sign of deceit, but the old man's eyes were steady, his anger replaced by a weary kind of sadness. "I see," Price said after a moment. "I'll speak with Clara and try to get a clearer picture of her grievances, but I must ask, are there any other reasons she might harbor such hatred toward you? Anything that might have pushed her to this point?" Edward hesitated, his gaze briefly flickering toward Dr. Wilton, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. Price caught the glance, making a mental note of it. There was something there, something unsaid. "No," Edward said finally, his voice quiet. "Nothing beyond what you've heard." The conversation came to a close, and the meal continued in a strained, uncomfortable silence. Inspector Price ate sparingly, his mind preoccupied with the evening's events. As the guests finally retired to their rooms, Price lingered in the dining room for a moment, staring into the flickering fire. The quiet of the manor felt unsettling, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the storm to break. Chapter 3. A Death in the Night. Inspector Price had barely closed his eyes when a sharp, insistent knock shattered the stillness of the night. The rhythmic patter of rain against the window pane had lulled him into a light sleep, but now, as the door to his guest room creaked open, the cold, oppressive atmosphere of Hawthorn Manor rushed in once more. "Inspector," a trembling voice called out from the hallway. It was one of the housemaids, her voice thick with panic. Sir, something terrible has happened. Mr. Hawthorne, he's dead." For a brief moment, Price remained motionless, allowing the weight of her words to settle in his mind. Edward Hawthorne, dead? It was not entirely unexpected. Price had sensed an eruption of violence in the air since his arrival. He quickly dressed and grabbed his overcoat, following the maid down the dimly lit hallway. The heavy, oppressive silence of the manor was punctuated only by the soft echo of their hurried footsteps. As they neared the study where Edward's body lay, Price could already hear the low murmur of voices, guests and staff alike gathered in anxious confusion. When Price reached the doorway to the study, he paused for a moment, surveying the scene. The door was ajar, and just inside, he could see Edward's body slumped over his large mahogany desk. A pool of dark crimson blood had soaked into the papers scattered across the desk's surface, glistening faintly in the light of the single oil lamp that illuminated the room. The rest of the study was steeped in deep shadows, making the grisly sight all the more haunting. Lady Evelyn Kensington stood near the door, her face pale and her expression one of distaste rather than shock. She held a lace handkerchief to her nose, clearly repulsed by the sight. Charles Benton, his usual suave demeanour absent, stood by the window, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his brow furrowed in disbelief. Dr. Frederick Wilton knelt beside Edward's body, his face grim as he inspected the lifeless figure before him. As Price stepped inside, his presence commanded immediate attention. The gathered guests looked to him for direction, their faces shadowed by a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Dr. Wilton rose from his crouched position as he approached Price. "He's been dead for at least an hour, possibly more," Wilton said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "It's clear that his throat was slashed, but there's no sign of a struggle." Price nodded, kneeling beside the body, to take in the grim scene for himself. Edward Hawthorne's lifeless face was twisted into an expression of surprise, his eyes wide and unseeing. A deep, jagged cut ran across his throat, the work of a sharp blade. Blood had pooled beneath his chair, staining the plush carpet. Price's eyes followed the trail of crimson droplets that led from the desk to the fireplace, where the dark stain abruptly stopped. "Who found him?" Price asked, glancing up from the body. "It was I," said the butler, who had appeared quietly in the doorway. "I came to check on Mr. Hawthorne around midnight, as I usually do. When I knocked and received no answer, I entered and found him like this." Price stood, scanning the room. The heavy curtains were drawn tight over the windows, allowing no glimpse of the outside world. The study was a fortress of dark wood and leather, its shelves lined with books and ledgers detailing Hawthorne's vast business dealings. There was only one door, and no sign of forced entry. The windows, too, appeared untouched. The most curious detail, however, was the small iron key still dangling from the lock of the study's heavy oak door. "Was the door locked when you arrived?" Price asked the butler, who seemed to hesitate before answering. No, sir. It was closed but unlocked when I found it." Price's brow furrowed. He moved to the door and examined the key more closely, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to form in his mind. The door had not been locked, yet the key was in the lock. This suggested that someone, perhaps Edward himself, had locked the door from the inside, but the killer had somehow escaped without unlocking it from the outside. The beginnings of a locked room mystery. Price turned back toward the assembled guests, his eyes sweeping over each of them, looking for any subtle sign of guilt or unease. "Where were each of you when Mr. Hawthorne was murdered?" Price asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Lady Evelyn sniffed delicately, dabbing her handkerchief at her lips. "I was in my room, Inspector, preparing for bed. I heard nothing, and I most certainly did not leave my room." Dr. Wilton cleared his throat. "I too was in my room. I spent some time reading before turning in for the night. I only came here after the butler informed me of Mr. Hawthorne's death." Charles Benton, who had remained by the window throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "I was in the smoking room," he said, his voice unusually subdued. "I often take a drink there before bed. I heard nothing either." Price turned his attention to the butler. "And you? You said you found him around midnight. Is that correct?" The butler nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. I didn't hear any noise before that. Mr. Hawthorne was alone when I last saw him, several hours before." As Price contemplated their responses, he noticed something peculiar on the desk, an ornate letter opener lying on top of a stack of papers. It was made of silver, its sharp edge glinting faintly in the lamplight, yet it was too clean, too polished. It hadn't been used to slit Edward's throat, of that Price was certain. He bent down to examine the blood-stained papers strewn across the desk. There was something odd about them, not merely that they were soaked in blood, but that they appeared to be financial records, hastily scrawled notes in Edward's distinctive hand. Some were recent, others much older, dating back several years. His fingers brushed over one particularly damning document, a letter dated from nearly a decade earlier. "Interesting," Price muttered to himself, standing up and placing the paper into his coat pocket. Whatever business Edward had been conducting in the hours leading up to his death, it had clearly been important. But who had discovered it? And more importantly, who had reason to kill him over it? Before Price could ponder further, a sudden commotion erupted from the hallway outside the study. The sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices reached his ears, followed by a sharp, piercing scream. Price bolted from the study, his heart racing as he followed the noise to the source. At the top of the grand staircase, several servants had gathered around a figure collapsed on the floor, their faces pale with horror. One of them, a housemaid, was sobbing uncontrollably, pointing toward the lifeless body sprawled on the landing. It was Clara Hawthorne. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide open in terror. A dark bruise encircled her neck, clear evidence that she had been strangled. There was no sign of blood, but the violence of the act was unmistakable. Clara had been murdered, just as her uncle had been, mere hours earlier. Inspector Price knelt beside her. He hadn't expected this. A second murder, so soon after the first. Whoever had killed Edward Hawthorne had now taken another life, and Price was certain that the two deaths were connected. "What happened?" Price demanded, turning to the housemaid who had discovered Clara's body. I found her like this, sir," the maid stammered, her voice quivering. "I was coming up to check on the rooms when I saw her lying here. I don't know what happened." Price quickly examined Clara's body, noting the distinct pattern of bruising around her neck. The killer had been precise, deliberate. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was calculated, just like Edward's murder. But why had Clara been targeted? Was it because she knew something about her uncle's death? Or had her own ambitions made her a target? As Price stood, the full weight of the night's events pressed down upon him. 2 murders, both within the walls of Hawthorn Manor, and both seemingly without witnesses. The killer had struck twice, and yet there was no obvious trail to follow. Price took a deep breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answer lay somewhere within the tangled web of the Hawthorne family's history, a history steeped in secrets, betrayals, and long-held grudges. As the rain continued to fall outside, Price knew one thing for certain: the murderer was still inside the manor, and if they had killed twice, there was no telling how far they would go to protect their secret. Chapter 4: Suspicions and Motives. The oppressive silence of the Hawthorn Manor was punctuated only by the occasional murmurs of the staff, whispering among themselves, their faces pale with fear. 2 deaths in one night. Edward Hawthorne, the stern patriarch, and now his niece Clara, found strangled on the grand staircase. As Inspector Price stood at the top of the staircase, staring down at Clara's lifeless body, his mind filled with questions. What linked the 2 murders? The brutality of Clara's strangulation was different from the cold efficiency of Edward's murder. Was this the work of one killer, or were these 2 separate acts by different people? He gestured for the body to be taken to one of the guest rooms for further examination and returned to the drawing room, where the remaining guests had gathered. Lady Evelyn Kensington sat stiffly in an armchair, her sharp features unmoved by the tragedies. Dr. Frederick Wilton, his face ashen, stood by the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed on the fire. Charles Benton was pacing the room, looking rattled. All eyes turned to Price as he entered the room. 2 people have been murdered tonight, he started. First Edward Hawthorne, and now Clara. The fact that both killings happened within hours of each other is no coincidence. I believe the murderer is still in this house, and I intend to find out who it is. The gravity of his statement settled over the room, like a suffocating blanket. Benton stopped pacing. Dr. Wilton shifted uncomfortably, while Lady Evelyn merely raised an eyebrow, her lips pursed. Price began with the facts. Edward was found dead in his study, his throat slashed, and the door locked from the inside. Clara, however, was strangled on the staircase. The 2 methods of murder suggest different levels of intimacy with the victims. Edward's murder was calculated, almost clinical, but Clara's was personal, brutal. Lady Evelyn finally spoke, her tone cold. Inspector, I fail to see how any of us could have committed such heinous acts. We were all in our rooms, as you've been told. Price met her gaze, unflinching. So you say, Lady Evelyn. But 2 people are dead, and no one outside this house could have done it. One of you had the opportunity to kill, and one of you had a motive. He turned to Dr. Wilton. You've been close to the Hawthorne family for many years, haven't you, Doctor? Wilton swallowed nervously, his hands fidgeting. Yes, I've been their physician for over 2 decades. I treated both Edward and Clara, as well as Clara's parents before they passed. And Edward's health, was it declining recently? Price asked, his voice probing. Wilton hesitated, his gaze darting toward Lady Evelyn before returning to Price. Yes, Edward was not in the best of health. His heart, he had a weak heart, but I don't see how that's relevant. He was murdered, not taken by illness. Price nodded slowly. Perhaps, but a man in Edward's position, with his wealth and influence, may have had enemies, even within his own family. You were in his confidence, Doctor. Did Edward ever mention concerns about his niece Clara? Dr. Wilton's face tightened, and he glanced nervously around the room. He mentioned her, yes. Edward felt that Clara had become, how shall I say, unmanageable in recent years. Her anger toward him had grown, and they had not been on good terms. But her anger was real, wasn't it? Price pressed. She believed Edward had wronged her and her parents. Was there any truth to that? Wilton opened his mouth to respond, but faltered, clearly torn. Lady Evelyn, who had remained silent up until now, interrupted, her voice sharp and commanding. Enough of this nonsense, Inspector, she said, her tone filled with impatience. You're wasting your time with these ridiculous questions. Edward's dealings with Clara's parents are ancient history, and they have no bearing on what happened here tonight. Clara was an emotional wreck, prone to dramatics. If anything, she brought this upon herself. Price turned his gaze to Lady Evelyn, his expression unyielding. Is that what you believe, Lady Evelyn? That Clara deserved to be murdered? Her eyes flashed with indignation. I didn't say that, but Clara was a troubled young woman. She couldn't let go of the past, and it consumed her. She and Edward were bound to have another falling out, but murder? No, I didn't think it would come to that. Price studied her for a moment, noting the coldness in her words, the lack of sympathy for Clara's death. "And what of you, Mr. Benton?" Price asked. "You've been a close associate of Edward's for some time. What was your relationship with him and with Clara?" Benton ran a hand through his hair. "Edward and I had a business relationship. He helped fund several of my ventures, and in return, I advised him on certain financial matters. As for Clara, we weren't close, but we'd spoken on a few occasions. She didn't trust me. She thought I was only interested in her uncle's fortune, which wasn't true." Price raised an eyebrow. "And were you?" Benton bristled at the implication. "No, of course not. I respected Edward, and I had no intention of meddling in his family affairs. Clara's suspicions were unfounded." "And where were you when Edward and Clara were killed?" Price asked, his voice low and steady. "I was in the smoking room, as I told you before," Benton replied quickly. Price nodded, but his mind was already working through the possible motives each of the guests could have had. Lady Evelyn's cold detachment, Dr. Wilton's loyalty to the family, Benton's financial dependence on Edward, each had something to gain or lose by the deaths of Edward and Clara. He turned back to Lady Evelyn. "Lady Evelyn, you were Edward's closest confidant, weren't you? You knew his affairs better than anyone. Were there any arrangements made regarding his will?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I am well aware of Edward's financial affairs, Inspector. As his confidant, yes, I know what was in his will. And no, I had nothing to gain from his death. If you must know, Edward left the bulk of his estate to various charities. Clara would have inherited a small sum, but that was all. I was not a beneficiary." "Interesting," Price remarked, "and yet Clara seemed to believe she was entitled to much more. Did she know the contents of the will?" Lady Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "She knew enough to make her angry. Edward showed her a draft some years ago. She was outraged at how little she stood to inherit." Price's mind raced. He recalled the bloodied financial documents he had discovered on Edward's desk. What if those papers were the key? What if Edward's murder hadn't been about the family feud at all, but something far more dangerous? He reached into his coat and retrieved the document he had pocketed earlier. It was an old letter, dated nearly 10 years ago, and it was addressed to none other than Dr. Frederick Wilton. "Doctor," Price said slowly, holding up the letter, "care to explain why this letter, detailing a series of financial discrepancies related to Edward's business dealings, was on his desk the night he was murdered?" Dr. Wilton's face turned ashen, and he took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know what that letter is. I swear, I have no idea why it would be there." Price's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I think you do, Doctor. And I think Edward knew too." The room fell silent as the weight of Price's words hung in the air. Chapter 5. The Locked Room Mystery. Inspector Price stood in Edward Hawthorne's study once more, the gruesome sight of the man's slumped body still fresh in his mind. But it wasn't just the murders that troubled Price. It was how they had been committed, especially Edward's, the locked room, the untouched windows, a perfect puzzle. As he surveyed the scene again, he felt a mounting urgency to solve the locked room mystery. If he could find out how the killer had entered and exited this room without being seen, he would be one step closer to uncovering the murderer. Price took a deep breath, mentally reviewing the clues he had so far. Edward had been found with his throat slashed. The key still in the lock indicated that the door may have been locked at some point, but there were no signs of forced entry, and the windows were closed and latched. The only other entrance was a narrow window above the fireplace, but it was far too small for anyone to enter or exit through. Price examined the lock on the door more closely. It was an old, sturdy lock, simple but effective. There were no signs of tampering. Could the killer have somehow locked the door from the outside? If so, how? The room offered no immediate answers. The furniture was heavy, antique, and showed no sign of disturbance beyond the area around Edward's desk. A few chairs sat against the far wall. The bookshelves were neatly arranged, and the fireplace was cold, its ashes long settled. The window above the fireplace remained an anomaly. Price had already concluded that it was too small for anyone to use for entry or escape, but something about it nagged at him. He called for the butler. "Yes, sir?" the butler asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Tell me again," Price said, "about the door when you found Mr. Hawthorne." The butler hesitated, wringing his hands nervously. "It was closed, sir. I knocked, but when there was no answer, I entered. I found him like that, at his desk." "And the key," Price continued, "was it still in the lock on the inside?" The butler nodded, his eyes darting toward the study door as if to confirm his memory. "Yes, sir, it was. The door wasn't locked when I found it, but the key was there, in the lock." Price considered this for a moment. So the door hadn't been locked when the butler found it, but the key had been in the lock on the inside. Had the killer left it there, knowing it would add to the mystery? Price dismissed the butler and returned to his study of the window. Something about it still didn't sit right with him. As he examined the latches more closely, a thought occurred to him. The latch itself was simple, but what if? He turned quickly, calling for one of the footmen. "Bring me a length of strong string," Price ordered. The footman left and returned moments later with a spool of thick string. Price took it, moving back to the window. He opened it slightly, just enough to fit the string through, and began threading it through the latch mechanism. Once satisfied, he pulled the string from the outside, watching as the latch clicked shut. It was possible. A skilled hand could lock the window from the outside using a piece of string or wire, creating the illusion that the room had been sealed from within. But this only explained part of the puzzle. The killer would still need a way to escape, and that was where the door became crucial. Price moved back to the door, examining the keyhole. He needed to understand how the killer could have locked the door from the outside while leaving the key on the inside. There were several possible methods, using a slender tool to manipulate the key from the outside, or even a duplicate key. Price considered the options carefully. If the killer had planned this murder in advance, they might have had access to a second key. But that would mean the killer was someone intimately familiar with the manor's workings. As he stood in the study, deep in thought, he heard a soft knock on the door. Turning, he saw Lady Evelyn standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm but edged with irritation, "are we any closer to solving this dreadful business, or are we to remain trapped here while the murderer runs free?" Price regarded her carefully, sensing her impatience. Lady Evelyn was a woman of cold precision, but her detachment troubled him. Was it simply her aristocratic indifference, or was there more to her involvement in the Hawthorne family's affairs than she let on? "We are getting closer, Lady Evelyn," Price replied, his tone measured. "But there are still many unanswered questions. For instance, what was Edward doing in this room before he was killed? Do you know if he was working on anything in particular that might have provoked such an attack?" Lady Evelyn's expression remained unreadable as she stepped further into the room, glancing briefly at Edward's blood-stained desk. "Edward was a secretive man, Inspector. He often worked late into the night, even when his health was failing. He never shared the details of his business with me or anyone else." Price nodded but pressed further. "And what of Clara? Did she know anything about her uncle's dealings?" At the mention of Clara's name, a flicker of something crossed Lady Evelyn's face. Was it guilt? Fear? It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual composed expression. "Clara was obsessed with her uncle's money," Lady Evelyn said, her voice cold. "She believed he owed her something she was never going to receive. She grew desperate in her final years, convinced that Edward had wronged her parents. But Edward was a man of principle. He wouldn't have let her manipulate him." Price watched her carefully, noting the subtle tension in her posture. Lady Evelyn was skilled at masking her emotions, but there was something she wasn't saying. "I see," Price said, folding his arms. "And yet Clara seemed to believe she had a claim to the Hawthorne fortune. Why?" Lady Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Clara was delusional. Her parents mismanaged their wealth, and she blamed Edward for their downfall, but she had no legal claim to his estate, and she knew it. Perhaps, Price replied, but I wonder if there was something more. Did Edward ever show signs of changing his will? Was Clara ever meant to inherit anything significant? Lady Evelyn's lips tightened into a thin line. If he did, he never mentioned it to me. And frankly, Inspector, I fail to see how any of this matters. Edward is dead and Clara is dead. Whoever did this is still out there, and the longer we waste time with these questions, the more danger we're in. With this, Lady Evelyn gave a curt nod and turned to leave. Once she was gone, Price moved back to the desk, where the blood-soaked document still lay. He retrieved the letter he had pocketed earlier, the one addressed to Dr. Wilton. Something about the letter nagged at him, a feeling that it was the key to unlocking the motive behind Edward's murder. But he needed more information. He needed to know why Edward had kept this letter for so long, and what it revealed about his dealings with Wilton. Price left the study and made his way to the room where Dr. Wilton was staying. He knocked on the door, and after a brief pause, Wilton answered. "Inspector," Wilton said quietly, "have you made any progress?" "I'm getting closer," Price replied, entering the room and closing the door behind him. "But I need answers, Doctor, about this." He held up the letter, watching as Wilton's face went pale. The doctor's eyes widened, and for a moment, Price thought he might faint. Wilton's mouth opened and closed several times before he finally spoke, his voice shaking. I don't know why Edward kept that letter. It was written years ago, over a decade. We had a disagreement about some investments he made. He believed I had mishandled the funds, but it was all a misunderstanding. We cleared it up." Price's eyes narrowed. "Cleared it up? It doesn't look that way to me. And if it was all in the past, why would Edward keep such a letter, hidden away for years?" Wilton slumped into a chair, his hands trembling. I don't know, but I swear to you, Inspector, I had nothing to do with his death." Price regarded him carefully, weighing the doctor's words. Wilton's fear seemed genuine, but there was something about the man's desperation that troubled him. The financial discrepancies mentioned in the letter might have been a motive for murder, but Wilton's involvement still seemed tenuous. "I'll need you to stay here, Doctor," Price said finally, pocketing the letter once more. "Don't leave this room. I have more questions for you later." Wilton nodded weakly, his face a mask of dread. Chapter 6. The Secrets Unveiled. The rain continued to batter the windows of Hawthorn Manor. Price sat in the dimly lit study, taking out the letter he had found earlier, addressed to Dr. Frederick Wilton, and spread it out on the desk next to Edward's scattered papers. The words on the page leaped out at him, revealing a business transaction gone terribly wrong. Wilton's investments had been tied to Edward's businesses, but Edward had accused him of mishandling funds, leading to significant financial losses. While Wilton had claimed the matter was resolved, Edward's decision to keep the letter suggested that the wound had never fully healed. Price's thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the door behind him. He turned to see Charles Benton standing in the doorway, his expression tense. "Inspector," Benton began, his voice strained. "I couldn't sleep. The events of the night, they're weighing heavily on me." Price narrowed his eyes. "Come in, Mr. Benton. What exactly is troubling you?" Benton hesitated for a moment, then closed the door behind him. "It's the murders, of course. Edward and Clara. I've been thinking about them, about why anyone would do such a thing, and I wonder if I might be next." Price watched Benton closely, noting the way his hands fidgeted as he spoke. The man was hiding something. "And why would someone come after you, Mr. Benton?" Price asked, his tone calm but probing. "Do you have reason to believe you're in danger?" Benton looked away, his brow furrowed. "It's just... Edward had enemies, Inspector. He was ruthless in business, and he didn't care who he trampled on his way to the top. I'm sure you've gathered that much by now. And Clara, she had her own issues with the family, but there's more to it than that. Price leaned forward. Go on. Benton swallowed hard. I've been involved in Edward's business affairs for some time now. I was his financial advisor, but things haven't been going well. Some of Edward's recent investments, particularly those tied to international trade, have been failing. He lost a lot of money, Inspector, and he wasn't happy about it. Price's eyes narrowed. Are you saying Edward blamed you for those losses? Benton nodded, his face tight with anxiety. He did. I tried to warn him that the markets were unstable, but he wouldn't listen. He kept pushing for riskier deals, convinced he could turn things around. When the losses mounted, he became, well, furious. He threatened to ruin me, to expose me as a fraud. I tried to fix things, but it was too late. Price considered Benton's words carefully. If what he was saying was true, then Edward's financial downfall could have been a motive for murder. But was Benton desperate enough to kill? And what about Clara? Price asked, steering the conversation toward the second victim. Did she know about these financial troubles? Benton hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Clara, she wasn't involved in the business, but she was always suspicious of me. She thought I was manipulating Edward, trying to steal his fortune. She confronted me more than once, accusing me of all sorts of things, most of it nonsense. But toward the end, I think she knew more than she let on. Price's brow furrowed. What do you mean by that? Benton sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not entirely sure, but I think Clara had access to some of Edward's private papers. She may have found out about the financial losses, or perhaps something else, something Edward didn't want her to know. She was determined to get her hands on the family fortune, and she might have uncovered something that could have given her leverage. Price's mind raced, considering the implications. If Clara had found out about Edward's failing finances, it could explain why she had been killed. Perhaps she had threatened to expose the truth, forcing the killer to silence her. But who stood to gain from her death? Benton, or someone else? Price leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Benton. Thank you for your candor, Mr. Benton. But I have to wonder, if Edward was threatening to ruin you, why didn't you leave before things escalated? Benton shifted uncomfortably. I couldn't, Inspector. I was too deeply involved in his affairs. If I left, I would have lost everything. I thought I could fix things, but, well, you see where that got me. Price watched Benton carefully, sensing that the man wasn't telling the whole truth. But before he could press further, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Frederick Wilton entered the room, his face pale and his hands trembling. Inspector, I need to speak with you, privately. Price gestured for Benton to leave, and the man quickly exited, casting a wary glance at Wilton as he passed. Once they were alone, Wilton stepped forward, his expression one of deep anxiety. Inspector, Wilton began, his voice shaky, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about the letter you found. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you sooner. Wilton took a deep breath. Edward and we had a disagreement many years ago, as I told you, but it wasn't just about the investments. There was more to it, something far more dangerous. Price's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Wilton hesitated, his hands wringing nervously. Edward was involved in some very questionable dealings, illegal dealings. Smuggling, Inspector. He had connections with certain groups overseas, and he was using his businesses as a front to move contraband into the country. I didn't know the full extent of it at first, but when I found out, I confronted him. Price's pulse quickened. And what happened? Wilton swallowed hard. He threatened me, Inspector. He said if I ever revealed what I knew, he would destroy me, financially, professionally, and personally. He held that over me for years. That's why I stayed silent. But recently, things started to unravel. Edward's smuggling operations were falling apart, and he was desperate to keep everything under control. I think Clara may have found out about it. Price felt a chill run down his spine. Smuggling, illegal dealings. It was far more than he had expected, and it made sense. Edward's secret business ventures could have been the motive for both murders. If Clara had discovered the truth and threatened to expose him, or someone else involved, she would have become a target. But who else was part of Edward's operation? Who else knew about this? Price asked. Wilton's eyes flickered with fear. I don't know for certain, but I suspect Lady Evelyn was aware of it. She was very close to Edward, and she had a way of turning a blind eye to things that didn't benefit her. Price's mind raced as he considered this new information. Lady Evelyn had shown little emotion over the deaths, her cold detachment unsettling from the start. If she had been complicit in Edward's illegal activities, her motive for silence would be clear. But had she been willing to kill to protect those secrets? Price stood, his jaw set in determination. Thank you, Doctor. I'll need to speak with Lady Evelyn immediately. Wilton nodded, his face still pale as he turned to leave. Price reached Lady Evelyn's door and knocked firmly. After a moment, she opened it, her expression one of mild surprise. Inspector, she said coolly, what brings you here at this hour? Price wasted no time. I've uncovered some rather troubling information about Edward's business dealings, information that leads me to believe you were aware of his illegal activities. Lady Evelyn's eyes widened, but she quickly regained her composure. What are you insinuating, Inspector? That I was involved in Edward's business? I assure you, I had no part in any of his dealings. Price held her gaze. Perhaps not directly, but you knew what he was doing, and you stood to gain from his silence. When Clara discovered the truth, she became a threat to both of you, didn't she? Lady Evelyn's lips tightened, her cold veneer cracking ever so slightly. You have no proof of any of this, Inspector, and you would do well to tread carefully. Price stepped closer, his voice low and unrelenting. 2 people are dead, Lady Evelyn, and I believe you know more than you're letting on. If you want to avoid further suspicion, I suggest you start talking. For a moment the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Fine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew about Edward's smuggling, but I had no part in it, I swear. I turned a blind eye because I didn't want to lose my position here. Edward and we had an understanding. But Clara, she was reckless. She thought she could take him down, but she didn't realize how dangerous he was. Lady Evelyn had admitted to knowing about Edward's illegal dealings, but the question remained. Who had killed him? And why had Clara been murdered shortly afterward? Chapter 7. The final clue. The storm outside Hawthorn Manor had intensified to a violent crescendo. Inside, the atmosphere was no less tumultuous. Inspector Price felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on him more heavily than ever. Edward Hawthorne's cold-blooded murder, followed by the brutal strangling of Clara, had torn the fragile threads of civility within the house. After Lady Evelyn's reluctant confession, Price had returned to the study, his mind racing through revelations he had uncovered over the past hours. Edward's smuggling operations, Charles Benton's financial troubles, Dr. Wilton's tenuous involvement, all were pieces of a puzzle, but none of them yet fit together perfectly. And then there was Clara, whose murder seemed more personal, more frenzied, as though silencing her had been necessary to preserve some dark secret. The inspector paced the study, the flickering light from the single oil lamp casting long shadows across the blood-stained desk. The smuggling operation had been the first breakthrough, but it wasn't the whole picture. There was something else at play, something more profound that linked these 2 murders, and he had to find it. As he stared at Edward's scattered papers, his gaze fell once again on the letter addressed to Dr. Wilton, detailing the financial discrepancies that had caused their falling out years earlier. He took the letter and spread it out on the desk, reading the lines again carefully. There, in the middle of the page, was a phrase that caught his attention. Assets moved to the overseas account. The overseas account. It seemed like a routine note at first, but Price now recognized its significance. The smuggling operation involved international trade, which meant large sums of money moved through channels that could be easily disguised as legitimate business transactions. Price's thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the study door. Turning, he saw Dr. Frederick Wilton enter the room, his face pale and lined with worry. Price's instinct told him that Wilton had more to confess, that the good doctor was finally ready to come clean. "Inspector," Wilton said, his voice trembling slightly, "I need to speak with you. There's something I've been hiding, something I should have told you sooner." Price motioned for Wilton to sit. "Go on, doctor. It's time to tell the truth." Wilton sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment, he said nothing, as though gathering the courage to finally unburden himself. Then he spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. "I've known Edward Hawthorne for nearly 30 years, Wilton began. "We were close, at least we were at first. He trusted me, and I was more than just his physician. I handled certain sensitive matters for him. But over time, I discovered that Edward wasn't the man I thought he was. His business dealings became more and more corrupt, and when I found out about the smuggling, I confronted him. He threatened to ruin me, to expose my involvement in some of his financial schemes. I had no choice but to stay quiet." Price leaned forward, his gaze intense. "So you were complicit in his illegal activities?" Wilton shook his head vehemently. No, I wasn't part of the smuggling, but I knew about it, and I didn't stop him. I thought that if I kept my head down, I could avoid getting caught up in it. But then things took a darker turn." Price's expression hardened. "What do you mean?" Wilton swallowed hard. "Edward wasn't just involved in smuggling goods, Inspector. He was involved in something far more dangerous, human trafficking." Price's breath caught. The gravity of the situation shifted. Human trafficking? He had suspected Edward's smuggling involved contraband, but this was far worse than anything he had imagined. "Are you saying Edward was trafficking people?" Price asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Wilton nodded, his face etched with guilt. "Yes, he had connections with certain criminal syndicates overseas. I didn't know the full extent of it until much later, but when I realized what was happening, it was too late. I tried to distance myself, but Edward kept me close by threatening to expose my role in some of his early financial dealings." Price stood, his mind racing. This changed everything. If Clara had discovered Edward's involvement in trafficking, it would explain why she had been murdered so brutally. She had always been outspoken, and if she had threatened to go to the authorities, Edward, or someone protecting his interests, would have had no choice but to silence her. But Wilton's confession wasn't the final piece. There was still the question of who had physically committed the murders. Edward's throat had been slashed in a calculated, precise manner, while Clara had been strangled in a fit of rage. Price needed to determine whether Wilton, Benton, or Lady Evelyn had the means and motive to carry out such violent acts. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Price asked, his voice filled with an edge of frustration. Wilton lowered his gaze, wringing his hands. "I was afraid, Inspector. I didn't know who else was involved. Edward had powerful connections, and I feared for my life. But when Clara was killed, I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. I'm telling you everything now because I believe someone in this house, someone close to Edward, was involved in the trafficking, and I fear they'll kill again if they're not stopped." Price paced the room, his mind working rapidly. But before he could probe further, the study door burst open again, and Charles Benton entered, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. "Inspector, I need to speak with you. I've found something in Clara's room." Price's attention snapped to Benton. "What did you find?" Benton held up a small black notebook, its leather cover worn and scratched. I went into Clara's room to see if I could find anything that might explain her murder, and I found this hidden in her desk drawer." Price took the notebook from Benton and flipped through its pages. It was filled with hastily scribbled notes, many of them detailing Edward's smuggling operation, shipments, names of contacts, dates of transactions. But it wasn't until Price reached the final pages that the real revelation struck him. Clara had written about discovering Charles Benton's involvement in the trafficking operation. Chapter 8. The Criminal Revealed. Price's blood ran cold as he read the entries. Clara had apparently grown suspicious of Benton's role in Edward's business dealings and had begun investigating him. She had uncovered correspondence between Benton and some of Edward's overseas contacts, letters detailing how Benton had facilitated the movement of people, not just goods. Clara had written that she intended to confront him, to expose him if necessary. Price looked up from the notebook, his eyes locking on to Benton. "You were involved," Price said quietly. "You were working with Edward, helping him run his trafficking operation." Benton's face drained of color. "No, I swear, I didn't." "Don't lie to me," Price thundered, stepping toward Benton. "Clara found out, didn't she? That's why you killed her. She was going to expose you, and you couldn't let that happen." Benton backed away, his hands trembling. I didn't kill her. Yes, I was involved in some of Edward's dealings, but I didn't know about the trafficking until it was too late. When I found out, I tried to back out, but Edward threatened me, and Clara, she was digging too deep. I tried to reason with her, but I didn't kill her." Price's gaze was unrelenting. "And Edward? Did you kill him to cover your tracks? Or did he know you were trying to leave the operation?" Benton shook his head frantically. "I didn't kill him, I swear. When I found out what he was really doing, I wanted out, but I didn't have the courage to confront him. I thought I could just wait it out, but then Clara, she wouldn't stop. I knew she would ruin me if she found proof, but I didn't kill her." Price wasn't convinced. The desperation in Benton's voice was too rehearsed, too carefully measured. He had the motive, and now Price had the evidence. Before Price could press Benton further, there was a sudden noise from the hallway, a loud crash, followed by hurried footsteps. He turned just in time to see Lady Evelyn rushing down the corridor, her face ashen and her hands clutching something to her chest. He bolted after her and caught up to her just as she reached the front door, pulling it open in a desperate attempt to flee into the storm. Grabbing her arm, he yanked her back, and in the process, the object she was holding fell to the floor with a metallic clatter. It was a blood-stained knife. Price stared down at the weapon, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "You," Price said, "you killed Edward," leading Lady Kensington back to the study. Her face was tight with defiance, but her eyes betrayed the fear that had begun to set in. Behind them, Charles Benton trailed, his face still pale from the shock of the night's events. Dr. Frederick Wilton stood in the hallway, his hands shaking as he watched the scene unfold. Price closed the study door behind them, his eyes fixed on Lady Evelyn. The blood-stained knife she had tried to flee with a reminder of her guilt. She had killed Edward Hawthorne to protect herself from the unraveling truth, and she had strangled Clara to silence her before she could expose the family's darkest secrets. For a long moment, Price said nothing. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the otherwise cold room. Lady Evelyn stood by the desk, her hands clenched into fists, while Benton remained near the door, his gaze flickering between Price and the woman who had just been revealed as the killer. Finally, Price broke the silence. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. "It's over, Lady Evelyn. You killed Edward and Clara to protect yourself. You can no longer deny it." Lady Evelyn's face hardened, her mouth a thin line of anger. "I did what I had to do, Inspector. Edward was a fool. He was going to bring this entire family to ruin with his illegal activities. And Clara, she was reckless. She would have destroyed everything I've built." Price folded his arms, his eyes narrowing. "You've been protecting Edward's smuggling operation for years, haven't you? Turning a blind eye to the trafficking, keeping yourself insulated from the fallout." But when Edward's business started to collapse, you saw that everything you had worked for was in danger. And then Clara discovered the truth. Lady Evelyn's nostrils flared, and for a moment, Price thought she might lash out, but instead she laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the room. Clara was a child, she spat. She had no idea what she was getting herself into. She thought she could use her knowledge to manipulate Edward, to get what she wanted. But she was too naive to understand the consequences of her actions. She would have brought the law down on us all. I couldn't allow that. Price took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. So you decided to kill her. Lady Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't deny it. She was a loose end. I had no choice. And Edward? Price pressed. Why kill him? He was the one at the center of it all. If anyone deserved to face justice, it was him. Lady Evelyn's lips curled into a sneer. Edward was weak. He had grown careless, allowing the business to spiral out of control. He would have been the downfall of this family. He had to be removed, before he ruined everything. Benton, who had remained silent until now, took a step forward, his voice trembling with disbelief. You killed Edward because he was going to ruin the family. But you've ruined it now, Evelyn. You've destroyed everything. Lady Evelyn turned her cold gaze on Benton. You're no better, Charles. You were part of this too. You helped Edward with his trafficking operation. You were just as guilty as he was. Benton shook his head, his voice rising in panic. I didn't know. Not at first. I thought it was just business, but when I realized what Edward was really doing, I wanted out. I didn't kill anyone, Evelyn. That was all you. Price watched the exchange, his mind racing as he considered how far the rot in the Hawthorne family had spread. Lady Evelyn had acted out of self-preservation, killing to protect her status and her wealth. But Charles Benton had been complicit in Edward's crimes, even if he hadn't committed the murders himself. Enough, Price said, his voice cutting through their argument. You both played your parts in this, but Lady Evelyn, you're the one who took matters into your own hands. You killed Edward, and then you killed Clara when she got too close to the truth. Lady Evelyn's defiance faltered, her hands trembling slightly as she glared at Price. Do you really think I'll go quietly, Inspector? Do you really believe you'll get away with this? Price's expression remained resolute. The evidence is clear, Lady Evelyn. The knife, the blood, your confession. It's over. There's nowhere left to run. For a moment, it seemed as though Lady Evelyn might try to fight her way out, but then her shoulders slumped, and the fire in her eyes flickered and died. She sank into a chair by the desk, her face a mask of defeat. I did what I had to, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone in the room. I did it for the family. Price moved toward her, his voice softer now. But in the end, you destroyed the very thing you were trying to protect. Lady Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on the floor, and she said nothing more. Price turned his attention to Benton, who stood frozen in place, his face pale with fear. As for you, Mr. Benton, Price said, his tone stern, your involvement in Edward's smuggling and trafficking operation will need to be fully investigated. You may not have killed anyone, but you're not innocent. Benton's knees seemed to buckle slightly, and he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I understand, Inspector. Price nodded, signalling for one of the constables he had summoned earlier to escort Benton out of the room. He turned back to Lady Evelyn, who still sat in silence by the desk. The proud, cold woman who had once commanded the respect of everyone in the house was now a broken figure, her carefully constructed world shattered by her own actions. Lady Evelyn, Price said quietly, you'll be taken into custody. There will be a full investigation, and you'll have your day in court. But for now, it's over. She didn't respond, her eyes glazed over with the weight of her defeat. The constables arrived, taking Lady Evelyn into custody, and the room slowly emptied of people. Price remained behind for a few moments longer, standing in the dim light of the study as the last of the evening's chaos finally began to settle.